there's been numerous different people. That's the point. There's been numerous different people that this young guy has challenged, and this one struck a chord with both of us because it's something that we've talked about a great deal, and it had to do with heaven, right? It had to do with who gets there. Now, that's the first thing, like what about the people who don't know, right? That kind of a question. But he was more specific than that, right? Because he talked about prison camps and stuff like this. Really interesting. They talked about kids who die of miscarriages. You know, what happens to them? And that led to the counter-apologist bringing up an extra point, and this is one we talk about as well, having to do with heaven and what's heaven going to be like for the miscarried baby. You know, is the baby going to be 30? Are we going to be able to recognize him or her? But it was a really, really interesting back and forth and exchange with his 8th grader.
Yeah, it was. And you could tell there was an articulated set of points that he was trying to lead him into a direction of the unknown. Like, how do you defend the unknown? A lot of the apologist statements started with, well, you know, I think in heaven it could be like, which that's the exact reason why he argued the way he did. Our young 8th grade friend, Chad, did. Was because it puts you in a very logically hard position to argue about things that you simply can't know about, which is things about death and claims about things that happen after you die. So he was simply going after just the basic fundamental ideas of how do you know what really happens to things after they die, and based on what we know here on Earth, what are there's certain gaps in the theory of spreading the word of God to everybody that people don't consider, and Chad was able to bring a few of those up. Like, what if you're a starving kid in isolated North Korea in a work camp that won't have any access to such things? What does God do about that? You know, or miscarried babies. He found these holes in the theory of just spreading God's word.
Right. You know, there's it's an age-old question. You know, what do you do with the people who don't know? And what makes it so interesting, I think, is that for being such an old question, religious people have never done really good about establishing a real satisfactory answer to it. And I guess what really stands out to me in that discussion were two things that the Christian guy said that go into kind of this old question. One of those was nature, and that nature is sufficient in many ways to lead somebody to the idea that God exists, you know. And that sounds like an interesting thing, but when they talk about that, they're not just saying some general deistic God, or maybe it's a she or a he. They believe in a Trinity, most of them do. Most self-identifying Christians believe in a Trinity, and that is God. And I've never really heard how from nature that we can really conclude anything close to the Trinitarian God as it's formulated in classical Trinitarian theology. Like, I just never.
Oh no.
Yeah,
no.
I've never understood that. And the second one, other than nature, what was the second one?
He just said, did he just?
There must just be a good reason.
Creation. You're saying he said nature, like just where he said creation is the answer.
Well, he says that's one of his answers to that, right? Is that, well, the created order of things, and the other one was that God is perfectly just, therefore there has to be an explanation, even if I don't understand it.
Yeah, well, and I think he started a few of his retorts with, well, somehow, I think, which that always puts you into hot ground.
Yeah, somehow, right? And what about the probability statement, too? I didn't mean to cut you off, but I'll just throw that in there, too.
Absolutely.
Probability. So number one was nature, right? Number two was justice.
Yes.
And number three was what we just said here just a second ago here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can't recall the third one.
No, it's okay. It's all right, yeah. So we're trying to tackle a whole bunch of these things. But he just kind of...
The other thing, too, is he kind of led him in circles. I mean, he absolutely did. It's hard. It's really hard to even organize what the apologist said, because he was being torn apart in 3 or 4 different places at once. But what you were talking about with probability, I think that's a big one.
That's what it was. The third one had to do with probability. So there's the brain fart. So nature,
and the probability
justice, probability. Those three.
They were using miscarriages as probability, where he said, well, what is it, 75%? There's miscarriages.
70%. Yeah, 70% natural, miscarriage rate. Right?
So by probability standards, we're saying that there's a vast bigger majority of those individuals in heaven than there would be anybody else. And a lot of people don't want to argue. They don't want to think these things through because they just want to have it. They've answered like the Apologist did. Well, somehow they have a way of communicating and making themselves known in heaven. Well, that's a very interesting theory, I would have to say. But I think about probability. Most people just have to have some sort of overarching view that there's an order to everything. But the truth is, it's probability. Things happen for no other reasons other than mathematical probabilities that we experience. You know, think about the person who says, "Oh, there's a ghost in my house because I was in the kitchen and a pot fell." Well, do you take into consideration the amount of times you walk into your kitchen and a pot doesn't fall? Nothing happens in the kitchen. You're there millions of times in your lifetime, and the pot falls once, but then there's something there. It's just an irrational way of thinking. It's probability that leads our lives. And because there's no definite answer to it, I think that scares people. But wouldn't they rather have the truth, I guess, is my question.
Right, and something interesting about the probability thing. That whole issue came up when talking about, you know, what happens to the miscarried children. And he pulled out that, well, you know, there's a good probability that those children are going to be going to heaven. And we just kind of chuckled at two things. Number one, how would you be able to determine to what degree that would be probable? And like on what basis are you saying it's more probable than not, number one? Mm-hmm. And number two, if this is true, then what is paradise actually going to look like? I mean, you would have at least, I mean, if every born adult, right, and every born person who wasn't miscarried naturally, if they all went to heaven, the ratio would be 70% babies, 30% adults in every other age.
And do they grow up?
And do they grow up? And if you whittle that down to what most Christians would say when they say, well, not many people are actually going to go to heaven. If you look at history as a big picture, the vast majority of people who have lived are not part of the frozen chosen or the select few. So they're going to find themselves burning forever in hell. And so let's say 10% of those people, you know, you're looking at that point that heaven is going to be overwhelmingly, almost entirely nothing but miscarried babies.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not joking. Like that's
no, it would mathematically it would be.
It would be so. The ratio would just be so bizarre. What heaven would look like if, in fact, that was true and that was the case. But just the whole conversation was so interesting, and to hear this guy, and could you tell just how riddled he was, how baffled he was, all the like when he heard it, he went into gospel mode and just kind of went through the whole Romans road with that, and well, you need to remember sin, and like stuff that had nothing to do really with the question that he had laid out, but there's really not much of a theological answer to any of that stuff.
That's right. And as that kid, I mean, we had an 8th grader that drug him out into deep water and found out he couldn't swim. I mean, really, that's what happened. He asked him questions where he had to give succinct answers, and all of the answers had to rely on somehow, I think, maybe, there could be, I believe it to be, but is that a rational way to look at things?
No.
Is that a rational way to live your life, or is that how you want to logically lay out the structure of the way you're going to look at your life? I don't think so.
And what would be off the table if we accept that kind of reasoning as valid reasoning about the other side of the door? What would be off the table? Like, I mean, at that point, could any individual truth claim by any believer be said to be, well, that's just nuts? I mean, or is it like, well, you're birds of a feather. Like, well, how do you determine which bird to fly with on this score?
Yeah. Well, it's very strange how human beings do that too. We have such a blurred line with what we consider to be completely intolerable and what we consider to just be, it's a religious belief. Because logically, there's people that will make claims on things that just simply aren't true, and we know they aren't true, and we can dismiss them without a second guess. But somehow when we invoke a celestial appeal to authority, all of a sudden these crazy claims become justified, and they stay in the town square longer than they should, I think. Ridicule is a good thing in some cases. We need to be able to say, oh, no, that's a terrible idea. It needs to be cast out. And I believe it came from a deity.
We need to exercise that stuff. It reminds me of that whole discussion I had. I think it was the first episode. It was the one you weren't on, and it was about the ghosts, right? And the claims made by the woman. I wish I remember her name. The woman that was featured in this news spot in Pennsylvania about the haunting of her house, right? Alleged haunting, and the kind of claims she was making about reality and what was really going on. That's not just a ghost. It's a demon, and it's not just a demon. It's trying to shut you up because you're trying to get the story out there.
Yes.
That's not just a weird feeling. That's an actual scratch from a celestial being, right? All of these claims and how they were accepted just at face value by the reporter, and it's kind of the same thing here. At what point, right? What claim can we look at and just say, you know what? That's just Looney Tunes. That's just bizarro world, and I don't believe that. And what do you do in situations where ridiculous beliefs are given a ridiculous amount of respect, like in a society, and say, what do you do, right, to say, let's level this field and say, if we're saying that about the voodoo doctor over here with his chicken bones and urine, what are we going to say about the person over here with a scapular or with holy water or blessed oil or whatever? What do we say of that magician too? And I think, like you said, I think ridicule is maybe a great place to start. And I don't think that ridicule necessarily has to be nasty or mean-spirited or done out of ill will. I think that ridiculous ideas, by definition, are worthy of ridicule. I think that's about it. Definitionally speaking, it's worthy of it, right?
I mean, it's not to intimidate anybody, but yes, there is such a thing as a dumb answer, and yes, there are such things as dumb ideas. And sometimes, I'm not saying it's not that we cast out and we don't discuss these ideas, but, I mean, we see monotheistic cultures clash all the time over their deeply held belief systems that are usually irrational in a lot of cases. And it seems like the two irrational beings come to a head with each other more than they do with the logical world.
Speaking of dumb ideas, dude, what's the news there with old Hercules?
Oh yeah, we got Mr. Sorbo is
Mr. Kevin Sorbo, dude. Speaking of dumb ideas, right?